In the summer of 1984, the Oregonian convened a panel of experts from the state and region to monitor the status of various sectors of the economy. Every 6 months, the group gathers to give its forecasts regarding wood products and high-tech, financial markets, and foreign trade and small business. They will gather next week for the 4th time. The City Club, on the other hand, acknowledges the pace of Oregon's economy, and we convene this distinguished group only once a year to hear its prognostications. The group first appeared in January of 1982, and they occasionally take the show on the road to other audiences. Last week, I heard a prediction that in 1986, Oregon's agriculture, timber, and electronics industries are going to be sluggish. Under those circumstances, I really wondered whether we needed to devote our entire Friday program to an assessment of whether Oregon is going to join the recovery. However, there are very important predictions that the panel ventures and which should help round out today's program. Loren, last year, when you were asked whether the City Club would invite you back, you answered with a resounding yes. Indeed, you made us a deal we could not resist. Secondly, you predicted that the 49ers would win the Super Bowl, and therefore, the market would do well. You single-handedly helped the overall average of the panel. Today, Today, would you please be prepared to tell us if the Chicago Bears will take Super Bowl 20, and if the Bears do prevail, what will that do to the stock market? In addition, we have asked the panel to discuss both the national and the state picture. We've asked them to tell us about the impact of Gramm-Rudman Amendment, the tax reform bill, the budget, and the trade deficits. So without further ado, moderating today's program is Dan Goldy, a private consulting economist and a member of the program committee of City Club. He formerly served as director of the economic development for the state of Oregon. Prior to returning to Oregon, he was president of a multinational corporation and chairman of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce International Committee. He also served as international trade coordinator during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Dan Goldy will introduce each of the panel members. At this time, please give a warm welcome to Ray Broughton, Kevin Kelly, Loren Wyss, and Dan Goldy.
Thank you, Arcelia. Can you hear? Is these working? Is this working all right? Okay. You can see how prescient the program committee was in scheduling this session just in the week in which the stock market took quite a reversal in form. I know my fellow panelists need no introduction except for those of you who have not shown up year after year, but they're all, I understand, a year older and presumably quite a bit wiser. So let me introduce them and tell you who they are. On my immediate right is Ray Broughton, Vice President and Economist of the First Interstate Bank of Oregon. He was a co-founder and past chairman of the Portland chapter of the National Association of Business Economists. He's been a member of the American Bankers Association's Economic Advisory Committee and of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. Next to him is Kevin Kelly, who is Senior Vice President and Manager of Corporate Planning and Development for U.S. Bancorp. He co-authors a column for United Press International on economic matters. He has served as Vice Chairman of the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors and President of the Portland chapter of the National Association of Business Economists. And next to him is Loren Wyss, who was formerly a Principal Officer of Columbia Management Company and Columbia Daily Income Company. He is now a private investment counselor. He has served as Vice President of the State Board of Higher Education and as a member of the Governor's Economic Recovery Council. He has just been appointed by the Governor to the new TriMet Board, and I'm sure he will include in his predictions today what the fares will be when light rail goes into service in September. Now, the way we're going to proceed, each of us are going to take 6 minutes to present our forecasts for 1986, address a few subjects which we have divided up among us, no collusion, but just divided up the subjects, confess whatever errors we can remember in our 1985 forecasts, and tell you what is our biggest worry or what we think may be the biggest surprise in 1986. After our initial presentation, we will do a bit of arguing among ourselves for 10 minutes up here. And then it will be your turn to have at us. Get out your saws to take down the limbs on which we will have perched. Now, this year we have been asked to predict whether Oregon will join the recovery, something it has not done thus far. So a brief description is in order of the national recovery to which we are aspiring. After a vigorous 6.8% rise in gross national product in 1984, the U.S. economy slowed in 1985 to an estimated 2.4% rate of growth. Interest rates dropped sharply in the closing weeks of 85 and are at their lowest levels now in 7 years. Inflation is also at a very low level, but with some small increases evident in the last few months. Economic predictions for 1986 range from vigorous growth of 4.7% in national GNP to an anemic growth of 1.7%, with some noted economists like Alan Greenspan forecasting a recession by the end of '86. With Oregon's economic growth running at about half the rate of the nation, it could make a great deal of difference to us which forecasts prove to be correct. The crystal ball, as Orcelia indicated, is unusually clouded this year by the potential impacts of Gramm-Rudman, tax revision, you can call it reform if you like, the farm depression, the imminent collapse of OPEC, and the drop in the value of the dollar. We are going to try to sort all of this out for you. Ray Broughton is going to go first. He will, among other things, discuss the outlook for gross national product growth, inflation, interest rates, and how demographics are affecting Oregon's economy. Ray, have at it.
Thank you, Dan. A large subject for 6 minutes. A year ago, and I quote what I was saying then in writing, all in all, 1985 should see another year of growth for the Oregon economy, not quite equal to the rebound of 1984, but still a welcome back-to-back year of recovery following 4 years of decline. And I think that's about what happened at the time. Data indicated a 30,000 growth of jobs in 1984. Under the revisions, that was increased to nearly 4%, or some 37,000 jobs. And I might add that except for 1982, there usually is an upward revision. On the other hand, I had expected a better performance from the other diversified manufacturing. It was quite clear that there would be weakness, continued weakness, in resource-based economy, portion of our economy, government with products, agriculture. We had a temporary snag in manufacturing of transportation goods, which seems to have recovered, and a more sustained decline afflicted high tech. Now, based on 11 months data for 1985, it looks like we had about a 21,000 increase, or 2.1% in 1985. And when we get through with the revisions, I suspect that it'll be closer to a 25,000 gain rather than 21,000. On the national scene a year ago, I anticipated no recession, and of course that's what we got. I did say, however, that the Congress and the administration had finally put themselves into a sufficient box that they would have to begin to straighten out the fiscal house. My target date was July 1. It came a little bit later, but in the form of the Gramm-Rudman Amendment. Now, for December 20, 1985 outlook for this coming year, I concluded about, as far as Oregon is concerned, that it will be much like 1985. Relatively slow growth in total wage and salary employment, about 2% or some 20 to 25,000 jobs max over the year. I'm supposed to talk also about the drop in Oregon's in-migration. We lost about 65,000 people net outflow between 1980 and 83. In 83, 84, this is mid-year to mid-year, we had a return flow of about 7,000. And of course, there's maybe the temptation to say, okay, 7,000 return, relate that to 37,000 increase in 1984 in Oregon jobs, but that just doesn't work. Last year, again, probably 1 to 25,000 job increase, and no change in the net in-migration or out-migration, zero. Everything was net natural increase. And the reason for that is that during the 1980s, demographically, we're seeing a lot more Oregonians maturing into household forming ages than we were during the 1970s. We don't need to import as many people. I'm supposed to talk about the gross national product. I think perhaps the most important factor here is the role reversal between fiscal and monetary policy. It's been natural for Congress and the administration to be stimulative, and under Hollings, Gramm-Rudman Hollings, will be a drag on the economy. So monetary policy, instead of stepping on the brakes, is going to have to help to offset the effects of that drag by being stimulative, which would suggest ultimately, but not right away, the likelihood of some somewhat lower interest rates. I'm assuming for the United States, this is real GNP, and so that my colleagues will know what I'm talking about, I'm talking about 1982 dollars rather than 1972 dollars, a 2.8% gain for the year. And that's with a weaker first half, the second half of the year growing at about a 3.5% rate. We will see this tax change kicked around if the prospective date is what it appears to be, which would be January 1, 1987. We'd probably see some stimulative effect, particularly as the year wears on, where people try to grandfather present tax benefits. I would think that interest rates would tend to rise. There may be some weakness between spring and summer, but tend to rise then in the second half of the year, moderately all the way around. Inflation, I don't look for inflation to get out of hand, certainly not in 1986, for several awfully good reasons. Number one, it's no longer possible to paper over the huge federal deficits with printing press money. Secondly, wage contracts this year will probably average only about 3%. Oil prices are falling. And finally, productivity is rising, and there's all kinds of hidden or unmeasured productivity gains, particularly in the office. A simplest example I can think of is I asked one of our office machine repairmen whether the electronic typewriters were giving him a problem, and he said, well, when I trained to service a Selectromatic, it took me 5 weeks in New York City to train for that. To service today's equipment, it takes me about 2 hours with a video cassette. We're seeing all kinds of price cuts without cutting prices, and I just don't look for inflation to run away, at least not during 1986. My greatest concern for 1986, and that is that the economy may grow at a more rapid pace than I'm anticipating, which would call for the possibility of some resumption of inflation at a higher level than I'm looking at, and that would push interest rates up.
Thank you, Ray, and he stuck right to his 6 minutes. I didn't get a chance to ring the bell.
I'll give you a chance.
Now, Kevin Kelly comes next, and Kevin is going to include in his remarks the outlook for Oregon's agriculture sector, the changes that have occurred in the value of the dollar, and the outlook for the trade deficit. Kevin.
When the topic was suggested, will Oregon participate in this recovery for the topic, I went back and looked at some things I'd read back in the late 1970s, early 80s about Oregon in the 80s. And one of the phrases I'd heard by someone mention was the phrase that Oregon was pregnant with possibilities in the 80s. I think that may have been true, but we're currently in the 61st month. And I'm not expecting delivery shortly. That, in fact, seemed to be the general forecast of the panel. I'll go over just quickly the three major indicators, GNP, interest rates, and unemployment, and my mistakes for last year and my forecast for next year. But quite simply, the forecast for most of the panel members last year was that GNP at the national level would be a moderate growth, and it'd be weaker at Oregon. We wouldn't participate as much. We'd still be in the pregnancy stage, and that's exactly what happened. So I guess we were correct, and if you're correct, you might as well do it again. So that's my forecast for 86 as well. In terms of rates, I got my rates right. I said they would go up and down during 86. I just had my calendar reversed. They went up when I said down and down when I said up. But that doesn't stop me. I'm still going to forecast what I forecasted last year, again. That we'll see not a lot of change in rates, but maybe some weakness in the first half and a little more strength in the second. Now, my range, interesting enough, for that prime rate number that everybody wants to know about is 9 to 10, so it's not a heck of a lot of change from where we are right now. I just don't see a lot of movement unless one of the big surprises or worries that people are going to talk about occurs. Unemployment, I'm going to forecast the same as last year, a little change for the year. Neither the national economy nor Oregon's economy ought to grow fast enough to make a significant dent in the unemployment rate, and that's likely what's going to happen. Now, my topics: agriculture, trade, and the dollar. And since we only have 6 minutes, I'm going to give you an executive summary up front. Bad, better, depends on your perspective. Agriculture, the bad. I guess the best statement on agriculture is the story about the Midwestern farmer who won a $10 million lottery, and the news reporter shoved the microphone under his face and his wife's face and said, "You got to tell us what you're going to do with this. You're going to change your lifestyle. What are you going to do?" And he said, "Well, the wife and I really don't know much else, and we kind of like our lifestyle, so I think we'll just keep farming until it's all gone." I think we get, it may not take 10 million, but it's going to take a little out of the farmers this year. It's not, and unfortunately, they're long-term situations. I mean, there's nothing on the immediate horizon. There's nothing in the long-term horizon. Wheat prices and grain crops this year ought to be down again in price. The importing countries aren't importing anymore, or very highly, and the exporting countries are exporting a lot, and they're not going to give up market share. So the U.S. is going to be faced with more troubles on that particular front. I got some plus on cattle. Cattle prices ought to be up, but mainly because they've sold so many cattle in the last couple of years, they've cut their herds way down. The big question mark in agriculture next year is what impact is the Gramm-Rudman bill going to have on farm policy and the new farm bill, because it's not protected under the Gramm-Rudman cuts and is likely to take a fairly big cut. As I said, that's a real question mark. We don't know whether Gramm-Rudman is going to kick in or not, whether there'll be a tax increase or not. But let me simply put it this way. One, it won't have much impact in 1986. And two, even the farm bill that was passed would not have saved the weak farmers. The weak farms are still going to have the same problems they were having before. So it's unlikely that there's any scenario in which you're going to have a brighter picture for farming for 1986. Again, it's been said many times in Oregon. Oregon's very lucky on that front because of the diversity of crops and the nature of our agricultural industry in general. It's very hard to summarize it. Even though our two biggest producers are obviously wheat and cattle, there are a lot of other industries in the state that are in different up and down cycles at any one time. Trade, better was the phrase on trade. Been a 17% drop in the terms of trade. That is the dollar relative to some major trading countries, Japan and West Germany in particular. That's sort of locked in some gains, I think, later on this year. We've already seen price increases coming out of those countries. That ought to help the terms within the next 3 to 9 months, and we ought to see some changes there and some improvements. Jumping down, though, because it's so interrelated, the dollar. The dollar, I think it's extremely important to recognize that the dollar has not dropped across the board as everybody keeps talking about the dollar dropping across the board. What's happened is a few other currencies have appreciated relative to the dollar. Our major trading partner, Canada, has not moved in its relationship to the dollar. And when we talk about lumber and wood products or those other problems, there's some very focused problems coming out of that effect. The major changes in the dollar have been against Japan and West Germany. I guess I would argue that has more to do with what's going on in Japan and West Germany than it does with what's going on in the United States. So that to predict a drop in the dollar next year, the next question always ought to be, well, how do you see it affecting the different trading partners? In fact, I don't see a big change in our relationship with Japan next year because we've seen most of the impact. Japan is one of the few countries that had a pretty good recovery, and our interest rates have fallen. That's allowed the yen to change relative to the dollar. West Germany in a similar situation. The other countries ought to kick in a little bit next year in terms of recoveries. I think you'll see some declines in the dollars relative to the other currencies as well, but modest changes. Probably on the order of 5 to 10% decrease in the dollar, trade-weighted, but coming out of some different countries than we saw in the last year. What that gets you to is, I guess, my biggest concern for the markets next year, and that is basically debt, period. No matter the potential for a risk comes from so many sources in debt, whether you're talking about farm debt, oil debt, foreign debt, bank debt, consumer debt. You've got a potential in a lot of places there. I'm not predicting any of them because, in fact, all of them appear to be under control right now. But at any time, any one of them can give the problem. That's the concern, I think. That's the risk in the marketplace. Interestingly enough, I think the biggest potential surprise is on the upside, not the downside. I think, as Ray suggested, we could, in fact, have a stronger economy in the first half to 3/4 of this year than anybody's anticipating, I think, on this panel. And because of that, we may have some problems later on, but nonetheless, we'll have sort of a surprising national economic forecast. Being Oregon economists, we tend to be a little biased by the state we're sitting in, given the fact that we're still pregnant and the rest of the country's been delivering babies regularly. We're going to have a more biased outlook on the downside, I think. So I think the surprise could be there. I guess the second biggest surprise is if we're all correct.
Now, the panel's humorist is coming on, Loren Wyss. And I want to say, Loren, you'll need all the levity you can muster when you tell us whether a major additional correction is coming in the stock market, what is going to happen to interest rates, and the potential impact of Gramm-Rudman. Loren?
I thought you were going to be tough and ask me what our TriMet fare was going to be.
I've already done that. You got to
gonna hold
include
me.
that, right?
Well, you know, 12 months ago, I tried to strip the mask of complacency from this whole charade and reveal that our opinions are really pulled from a hat at 11:30 on the day of the meeting, and that we each have one joke apiece which is written and assigned by Dan Goldy, and this is mine. Orcelia, I do appeal to you, turn over the rocks in your program committee and let's get this thing straight. As far as my report card goes, I was brilliant in saying that the market still had a playable rally left. At that point, the Dow stood at 1225, and believe it or not, until September the 20th, I was pretty much right. For the following 3 weeks after we met last year, the market went up from 1225 to 1300. And 1300 was a level that the Dow was still playing with in late September. Since then, we had an indication that anyone that tries to forecast on an annual basis is a charlatan or a fool. And of course, in the next few minutes, I will do that again, so you decide which. But in the last 3.5 months, the Dow has gone up more than 20%, and anybody who waited for a setback during that time was shut out. On interest rates and bonds, I think we were all generally correct, although I was the strongest in saying that bonds would rise throughout the year and rates would probably fall. I don't think most people realize how well the bond market has really done. Over the last 19 months, since May of 1984, the long bond has appreciated 450 basis points. That means that it is up 33%, and given the return of about 13.8% that bonds were carrying at that time, anyone who has been holding bonds over the last 18 months has gotten a 55% total return, or about 35% annually. That is a great rally. That's a historic rally, and I don't think that any of us expect that kind of thing to happen again soon. I did say that the 49ers would win the Super Bowl. It's the only game I watch per year, so you can tell how much faith you should put in my predictions there. I also said that you would complain in your program committee would be rude, but we would be nice and come back, and you were, and we did. So that's last. Now I do have the card from Dan's hat, and it says I'm to talk about interest rates and stock and bond markets and Gramm-Rudman in 4 minutes, and try to hum the minute waltz at the end of it. I'm not as hopeful as the rest of my friends here as far as GNP growth, because I think the Fed is pushing on a string, trying to get the economy to use the money that it supplied in generosity this year. A good part of that money flowed instead not into GNP productive uses, but into a very frothy, hyperactive financial market that was entranced with leverage buyouts and acquisitions. I think the Fed realizes that easier money in '86 would foster more of the same, and it must be at least as concerned with that speculative financial activity as with the real world of building up productive assets. So I would expect that throughout the year the Fed is going to be relatively tight, not as easy as they would otherwise like to be. Their statement about junk bond financing on Wednesday was the first strike against this non-productive transfer of existing assets and debt buildup within the corporate structure of America, and I think more will come. That certainly rules out any imminent cut in the discount rate. There are other problems of growth in 1986. The consumer is 2/3 of the economy, as you all know. The consumer has been building up debt twice as fast as consumer incomes have grown, and that's not sustainable. In the fourth year of an economic expansion, we would usually expect that there would be some spending on bricks and mortar, but we have 80% capacity instead of 92 or 93% capacity, which we usually have toward the end of an expansion. So there's no reason for most people to be investing in capital spending in '86. The Tax Reform Act of 1981 was, in effect, overturned with a change in the investment tax credit in 1986, so that again argues against more capital spending. So if the consumer is 2/3, and if productive spending is another 15%, that leaves the government. And I don't think Gramm-Rudman is designed to give us a very strong 1986 in government spending. So in short, the future ain't what it used to be. Getting back to rate projections, I don't think the Fed can let rates rise very much in 1986 either, for fear of a recession, which I expect still may come before the year is out. Monetarism's record is quite poor over the past few years. The economy simply hasn't responded to easy credit flows, but the Fed knows no other way, and I think will probably try again as the year goes on. On the whole, that should put rates in a narrow margin, up 50 to 100 basis points, mostly at the early part of the year, and then falling by 50 basis points as the economy worsens as the year goes on. I would generally call for a greater decline in rates, except that now current rates are ahead of conditions misled by the discount rate bulls. So I would expect long and short rates to move up much of the first quarter, unless the economy has some invisible rabbits in the hat that I don't see. And such higher rates then should fall as long-term trends toward higher bond values and lower rates of return come along in the second half. Therefore, for bond owners, I think that you should expect some weakness in the first quarter, gradually firming prices as the year progresses. If the economy strengthens throughout the first quarter, I will finally be wrong, sell some of the long issues, and wait until the recovery blows over, as it will. The equity market is just a little harder. It's affected by bond yields, of course. So with rising rates the first quarter, stocks will be under pressure. Coming on top of the euphoria that we've had the last few months, that's a pretty easy call. The next quarter will probably include the most important reaction of the year as well. If bonds recover because the economy weakens in the second quarter, can that be very good for stocks? Well, it gets a little harder here, of course. Sometimes it's true the economy and the stock market can move in different directions, as they did in '85. Corporate profits were down 5 to 10%, stocks gained about 30%. That made up for a lot of historic ground, with the market doing that much better than the economy. And the catch-up that we made during '85 deserves a lot of consolidation, which is a process that began in earnest this week. So I expect that with relatively small gains in earnings in 1986, that the market will not be satisfied. I would expect there to be some earnings surprises, therefore, and you can anticipate that stocks will rise less than 10% this year. At the same time, I think it will go down less than 5% by the end of the year. I'd predict a greater decline, except I think that we've begun to see the first wave of a rebuilding of interest in equities. You may know that twice in this century, the market has more than tripled over a space of 5 years. That's because new generations come forward and believe that holding stocks can make them rich, and of course it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I believe we are in the early stages of another one of those kinds of major moves in psychology and stock values. To help you along that path, let me remind you that if you simply took the averages back to 1967 on an inflation-adjusted basis, the Dow would be more than twice where it stands today. So we can really argue for much higher stock prices without a great economy. I just think '86 may be too early for it to happen. That leaves out Gramm-Rudman, which is too bad.
We'll
We'll
take
get
care
back
of
to
that.
that. Thank you.
And now it's time to hum the minuet. Okay, now it's my turn, and I'm supposed to address, in addition to everything else, the outlook for Oregon's biggest, most important industry, forest products, the potentials for new high-tech investments, and a new potential for Oregon's economic development in advanced science research. Well, let me see if I can cut through a lot of this, and first give you my forecast for '86. Very similar to what you've heard. Looks like a repeat of '85, sluggish rates of growth nationally, with Oregon continuing to lag behind the country with a higher unemployment rate and lower growth rate. I doubt the dollar has dropped, giving allowances to Kevin's analysis of what that means, enough to give a boost to Oregon's exports. And actually, the dollar has recently risen against the Canadian dollar, which will continue to exacerbate the lumber import problem. I see no relief in sight for Oregon's agriculture or metals and mining sectors, and only marginal improvement in some parts of the electronics high-tech industries. Now let me turn to the prospects for the forest products industry. When it gets sick, so does the entire state economy. Even in the diversified Portland metropolitan area, which provides services and supplies to the basic industries of Oregon downstate, a slump in forestry drags down the economy after a 4 to 6 months lag. Like '84, 1985 saw a new record softwood lumber consumption in the United States. But Oregon's share of the market dropped a little bit. But basically, we've had a good year of market. However, the big production in Oregon was turned out with about 21% fewer workers than we had in '79, productivity increases we've had. Prices during most of '85 for the lumber industry were terrible, in large part because of a flood of Canadian imports which saturated the market. Now, you read in the papers of a rash of mill closures, especially by the largest companies. What you probably didn't know was that some of those mills were purchased by small independent producers and are again operating with lower overheads and other lower costs. If Oregon's lumber industry can survive for just another 3 to 4 years, we could then see an upsurge in growth of the sort that powered Oregon's economic expansion in the late 1970s. This is because our two major competitors, Canada and the South, are liquidating their commercial timber stands at an alarming rate. Not only have they failed to reforest, but fires and insect epidemics have taken a fearsome toll. and southern pine, you'll remember, allegedly grew so fast you could watch it grow, has recently seen its growth rate slowed to a crawl. More than 78% of the timber in Oregon is in federal ownership and is on a sustained yield basis. So the long-term outlook is great if we can survive for the long term. But there are threats to the industry which could come to a head this year. 1986 is the year when the radical environmentalists, and I know we're all environmentalists, so I'm talking about the radicals in the environmentalist group, they're going to do battle this year to shut down a major portion of the industry. Their announced goal is to stop all old-growth timber harvest, which would mean a virtual halt of sales on the national forests and the ONC lands. Under pressure from these groups, the Forest Service will propose new forest plans in 1986 that would, if adopted, significantly shrink the size of the industry. Now, there are other threats to the forest industries. For example, the so-called tax reform bill, passed by the House just before adjournment. It has provisions in it which would severely and adversely affect the forest industries, which is why most of our congressmen couldn't vote for it. Hopefully, those provisions were put in by Chairman Rostenkowski to serve as trading stock with Bob Packwood when the House and Senate bills go to conference. But if the provisions were enacted, they would virtually put an end to private investment in forest management in this country. Finally, there's Gramm-Rudman. The flip side of that coin is that with 78% of the forest resources owned by the federal government, the timber supply for Oregon's forest industries depends on government appropriations. Forest Service and ONC sales funds will share the across-the-board cuts when Gramm-Rudman is implemented. Lower interest rates and 2.2 million housing starts, which are claimed to result from Gramm-Rudman, won't do Oregon's industry any good if it can't buy the timber on which to operate. If Oregon's forest industry goes down, gets hit hard, don't look for salvation from the electronics high-tech industry. Washington County should continue to do well on past commitments, but with reduced capital investment nationally in '86 and the further threat to such investment contained in the tax reform bill, I foresee a slowdown in expansions and new plant commitments for electronics. Finally, there is a new prospect for economic development and advanced scientific development. Perhaps you have read about the $4 billion superconductor super collider that would bring with it 3,000 top scientists and engineers and $500 million of annual expenditures. Oregon would be an ideal place for that facility, and Senator Hatfield's position as chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee ensures we would get consideration if the project should get the green light. But given the budgetary constraints and Gramm-Rudman, it is more likely that Oregon's future will be enhanced by the more modest but significant grants Hatfield has been obtaining for the new Science Center at the University of Oregon, the new Institute for Advanced Biomedical Research at the Health Sciences Center here in Portland, and for the Oregon Graduate Center. If Oregon gives its universities and higher education facilities the priorities and support they deserve, they in turn could provide the state with some of the economic diversification we so desperately need. Now, my biggest worry about 1986 is that the various threats to the continued existence of Oregon's forest industries will become reality, and we will be on our way to becoming the Appalachia of the West. The biggest surprise in 1986? When, in order to avoid deep slashes in defense spending, President Reagan reverses himself and endorses a tax increase as part of a budget compromise with Congress. Now oh, yes, thank you. Thank you, Ray. Now, we're supposed to take 10 minutes to argue among ourselves, but I'm going to cut that to 5 so we can allow maximum time for your questions. Okay, fellas, have at it. Who goes first?
I think we got the script.
Yeah, where's my question? I guess one question I would ask of Loren is something that came up, and that is his likelihood that there may be a recession in '86. I think he's the only one on the panel that would be suggesting that, or the possibility of it, and I'm just wondering if he'd elaborate a little on it.
Well, you weren't listening. Well, one of the things that I was supposed to get to, Kevin, that I didn't, was my feeling that Gramm-Rudman is a great yawning chasm that can gobble the economy as it goes down. It's a black hole, because as you know, it is required to reduce government spending when tax receipts are down, which means that it is pro-cyclical instead of anti-cyclical. So it would seem to me that today happens to be an important day for Gramm-Rudman. You may know the courts are testing whether or not it is constitutional, and this is the day at which the two federal offices will determine how much our current deficit really is. And if it's more than 192 billion, they will require that we have an immediate 20 billion cut off the current budget. I think that will begin to occur over the next 2 or 3 months. It's the first time the tooth fairy takes away the dimes, and I would expect that there would be a substantial reaction among the Congress of whether or not they can persist with that. So given Gramm-Rudman, a poor end user demand build up, and my expectation that there's not a lot of change left in the dollar, I just don't see where the forces exist with the tremendous amount of debt that exists within the system to give us any forward momentum. I expect we're just going to gradually slow down toward the end. It's not going to be any collapse, but we're going to have a recession, not a bad one, but a recession in 87.
Kevin, you mentioned that your biggest worry was the possibility of a major financial crisis of some sort. Possible default maybe by foreign countries. The banks, some of the banks, and certainly the S&L seem to be in tough shape with big loan losses that have been deferred and so forth. That if there is some kind of a major financial crisis, do you think that would produce a recession this year?
Could very quickly, I think, in terms of just what's happening in general confidence. The one segment of the economy that seems to be leading most people's predictions that we're not going to drop into the black hole this year is that the consumer will keep spending. Not that they'll keep spending necessarily last year's level or at any record levels, but nonetheless they'll keep spending. And there are some reasons to believe that. The consumer debt, in my mind, is not as bad as it has been painted in the press. But nonetheless, if you take away the consumer confidence, and you certainly would with a major debt crisis, especially if they're banks or their savings and loans, you could very easily drop down into the negative numbers for the year.
Pardon, you want to say something?
I was going to ask Ray if he had any feelings about tax reform. I think we had discussed that in one of our preliminary meetings, and I've forgotten what you were assigned to say.
Yeah, I do. Well, I'll go over it again for you.
Not too long, because I want to turn out the questions here.
I think that there will be a lot of discussion, a lot of heat and so forth, but that any action will be delayed until 1987. Therefore, there may not be any tax, quote, reform at all. Or if so, it would be more window dressing. But there will be enough threat in that, enough opportunity for investment to grandfather the tax benefits that it would give a kick to the economy now. I have to admit, Loren, that there is the possibility of a recession in 1986. However, my forecast, I think Kevin's, these were the most likely rather than thinking about. Seriously, on Gramm-Rudman, I think a lot of us have concerns. I had lunch with Phil Gramm a couple of years ago, and he was saying, well, no one congressman or senator can attack any other person's program back there, because then they marshal their forces and they beat down your good program, so nothing gets done. So his solution at that point was to put all the government programs and all of Congress into a bag with a finite amount of money and tie a string around the top and not let them out until they had decided what was good and what was bad. And some of these programs would get cut and others would be eliminated and so forth. Well, when Gramm-Rudman came across the way it is, where there would have to be equal cuts, such as Dan is concerned about, I wrote to Phil and I said, hey, this doesn't jive with what you were talking about. Well, it's been a month and I haven't heard back from him, so I don't know what to expect.
Okay, I think we're going to cut this off up here so you can have at us. Get your saws out, start sawing on the limbs. Or Celia, you take it from here.
Remember that only members of the City Club may pose a question. We'll start with Charlie Alcott. I believe you can use your mic, Charlie. And then Dan will direct the question to the panelists.
Thanks,
Charlie?
Cecilia. using Kevin's words, to bring Oregon's 61-month economic pregnancy to an end, over $25 million was allocated to economic development from Oregon lottery proceeds in the last session of the legislature. Last Tuesday, the Joint Legislative Committee on Trade and Economic Development met in Salem to discuss how to disperse these funds. Addressing the panel, how many new jobs can we expect in Oregon from these funds? And for Loren specifically, who's going to win the Super Bowl this year?
Who wants to tackle that one?
I'll take Loren's question.
Go ahead. You'll have to explain, though, how Bears can win and still give a boost to the Bulls.
Well, actually, aren't they the old? If Chicago won, it would be good for the
If
economy.
Chicago wins, they're the old National League, and that means
Yeah, but they're the Bears.
And it's certainly
Shut up.
it's certainly good for refrigerators.
Who's going to tackle
Wait,
Charlie's basic question, though?
I guess I'll start in that I don't have counting jobs from this. I think is going to be very difficult to do, not only this year but any time in the future. Economic development funds. It is very hard to point out jobs, and more importantly than jobs, increases in per capita income or any other types of measures that may be better measures of economic welfare. That is, you could create a lot of jobs in the state and bring down per capita income, and I'm not sure that we'd define that as economic development. So that to take the 20 million and say, here are the jobs we're going to create, I can't find them, quite candidly. I'm not sure, and I don't have the formula for which to allocate that 20 million, but I'm not sure that the ideas I'm hearing suggest that we're going to have any immediate pickup in economic development because of the usage of those funds.
I have to agree. I would look at the expenditure of these funds in the way that I would look at advertising of an institutional nature. Very difficult, if not impossible, to measure the effects of it. And that being the case, I'd like to see a major portion of that go into a long-range and necessary improvement to the Oregon economy, and that's to higher education.
Let me just say, as a former director of economic development for the state, it blows my mind. I used to have a biennial budget of about $2.4 million. And when I see what they've got now, it just absolutely boggles my mind. But I think the answer to Charlie's question is that we can't tell what effect it's going to have yet, because even though they allocate it, we don't know how they're going to spend it. I mean, how wisely they're going to spend it. So I think we're going to have to defer on that. Now, I think we should go to
Next
questions.
question. Someone ready with a question? Please use the microphone to identify yourselves.
I'm Charles Hall, City Club member. An area of growth over the past few years has been in entrepreneurism and small business. And what do you gentlemen see for the continued trend in the growth of entrepreneurism and small business, both in the Oregon and in the United States?
Anybody who wants to pick that one up? Loren?
Well, I believe that the 1980s are a period in which we will have higher real rates of interest than we had during the 60s and 70s, and I think that at the same time we will see that companies that control markets will be more aggressive in defending them. So the entrepreneur in the 1980s and 90s, in my opinion, is going to have to be better prepared for those kinds of trends, particularly the problem of borrowing money during a non-inflationary period. Inflation is not going to help in paying back that debt. And since most entrepreneurs exist on borrowed money, that's a situation that is going to be a chronic one, I'm afraid.
Let me give an opposite plus to that same.
He works for a
particular
bank.
picture. Yeah. We'll end. Our only criteria is that you pay it back. One of the things that I also think is happening, and maybe it's on a longer range scale than Loren's talking about in the next few years, and that is when he talked about protection of markets, the first thing I thought of is the change that's going on in markets. That is, as the United States has gotten wealthier, as we've distributed more things through mass production, I find the markets changing somewhat. I find the generation splitting into no one single mass market. You have 20% of the population being single people in this economy. You have, of the households, up until last May, I had 2 children and a wife not working, and I assumed that was middle America. In fact, that was 8% of the households of the U.S. So that there is no longer a one marketplace that you can point to. What that brings up on a positive side for entrepreneurs is the ability to target. All of a sudden, it is much harder to protect a market than it was in the past. That is, low cost is not going to do it alone, and a large company with mass production basically has low cost on its side. So that if an entrepreneur can find a market targeted, I think it's a relatively good next 10 years or so for that type of response.
May I take that forward just a little bit further than either of these two? And that is, if we can get through this present period where things like Gramm-Rudman and all the rest of it ultimately shake down into something that is does cut back the deficits and brings interest rates down even in real terms and so forth, I think we will see with this market segmentation a lot more return to the individual craftsman type of thing, if you will. In other words, a spur to entrepreneurship which would find itself expressed largely in Oregon, which is largely a small business state anyhow.
I've got to put in one word, much as I like to save time, say this. Basically, the big companies are the ones that can go abroad because of an overvalued dollar, or whatever they perceive, take their plants, their investments, and do it abroad. The smalls can't do that. In addition, I mentioned in my opening comments that here in the state in the forest products industry, the large companies have been shutting down their plants and going elsewhere where they think they can do better, but it's the smalls that are picking up those plants one at a time and reopening up with a different kind of operation. Basically, in the last few years, we've seen employment increases in the United States primarily occurring in small companies. So I say that there's a real place for entrepreneurship, provided the interest rates don't run them out, because they do depend more heavily on borrowed money.
Now, I'm going to go to the mic first, and then I'll come back to you and repeat your
Well, I'll
question.
yield to Ned Luke if he wants to get his in.
Good. Ed? Would the members of the panel please respond to where else would the lottery money have the most impact besides higher education?
Kevin?
In looking at economic development in general, it's, the key variables are infrastructure, what's available to be worked with, the productivity of your labor force, education, other associations with it, the costs of doing business in a state. The infrastructure, education are certainly two places to put the money. Where I think is a bigger handicap in the state of Oregon than either one of them, since we have a relatively productive labor force, is the cost of doing business in Oregon. And I don't just mean taxes, I mean everything. From a permit process, and if you talk about entrepreneurs, the permit process kills entrepreneurs. It is a hurdle they've got to get over, and they have a very difficult time doing it. They don't have the resources, the time, the energy to do it. We have lots of barriers in this state. We like to talk about releasing them, but we still have lots of barriers. Now, I don't know how that money gets allocated to attacking those costs, but that's an area I'd certainly start to focus in on.
Anyone else? Okay. Greg?
Infrastructure. I extend infrastructure, which is something that takes a lot of money, and it's of long duration in terms of its transmission of values. I include education in that, but I don't exclude other conventional types of infrastructure that may well be necessary to prepare the land for industry to utilize on some kind of payback basis.
At the microphone.
Charles Sykes, City Club. In the novel, The Crash of '79, the thing that triggered a real crisis was the withdrawal of foreign funds from our money center banking system. If this should develop, could that be the event which would make it seem that all bets are off on what direction we go? I don't care who wants to tackle
You're
that
referring
one.
to the book, The Crash of '79?
Mm-hmm.
That took an atomic bomb to blow up the oil fields of the Middle East, and I don't see that's too likely, although it is possible. In round figures, I answer the question like this. You know, banking lives by certain rules, the regulated industries, and I liken it to Mark Twain, who never lost a game of billiards in his own home because he reserved the right to change house rules whenever he wanted to. And this is already, we've seen evidence of this happening in New York and so forth. If the rules don't fit the circumstance, they will make the changes that are necessary. And that's why I don't see this as a major looming problem. It's one that could be handled, maybe with some difficulty.
Well, let me just say one thing. If Alan Greenspan's forecast is right, and some of what you heard up here turns out to be right, and the country does go into a recession before the end of '86, then we could get that precipitate drop in the dollar. We've had a kind of a gradual one, and it hasn't gotten down there. But if we got a precipitate drop in the dollar, then what Charlie Sykes is talking about could very well happen.
At the microphone.
Molly O'Reilly, City Club member. I'm not sure of the timing, but I understand that the federal government revenue sharing is projected to end. What effect would that have on the Oregon economy?
Who wants to tackle that one? One thing I could tell you is it's going to raise local property taxes, which is a real popular thing in the state of Oregon. And who else wants to comment on that? Nobody wants to comment on it. All I can tell you is that the end of federal revenue sharing, I don't think our communities are ready for it. And it's going to happen now. And I think that the Oregonians have a great big adjustment coming with a big tax increase facing them here to make up for in effect, the withdrawal of revenue sharing at the federal level.
Last question.
Yeah, Loren?
Excuse me.
Well, I was just going to say that we have to pay for public services one way or another. People have been happy with the Tax Reform Act of 1981, in which many of us did see substantial reductions in taxes. That's coming home to roost with these changes now in federal revenue sharing. And I think you will, over the next 2 years, see a tremendous increase in all kinds of user taxes in the city of Portland. Everything that you want to do is going to cost you twice as much, including over parking. So be prepared. Be prepared for it.
Last question, please.
Michael Wells, City Club member. There's been articles, particularly in the Oregonian recently, talking about the two economies in Oregon. One's based about, say, 50 miles in a circle around where we are now, and then there's everything else. What you've been talking about, I think, generally focuses right here. Do you see anything other than resource-based economy growth taking place on the coast, east of Bend, so forth?
There has been growth of the diversified economy throughout nearly all parts of the state. And this is because of the relative decline and in recent years actual decline, for example, in lumber and wood products and agricultural employment. Just to give you an example, in 1950, lumber and wood products jobs represented something like 18% of all wage and salary employment in the state. And today it's about 6%, or it may have dropped a little below that. We have been diversifying for a great many years, and this includes areas like Eugene, for example, and Medford. It's just that the dominance or the effect of lumber and wood products is still pervasive on the state's economy.
If you're looking for manufacturing plants or that type of growth, my suggestion is it's unlikely we're going to get it outside of the Willamette Valley unless we're getting it in the Willamette Valley. It's a spillover type of an effect. However, most people are not aware of the fact that the Portland SMSA has not recovered from the last recession. Both Medford and the Bend area have. And it's not because of manufacturing, but in the Bend area it seems to be because of tourism and some other related things. In the Medford area, I finally figured out what it was when I asked my branch manager down there why it was doing so well, and he said those checks from the California Trust Departments just keep coming in. There is a retirement community that's been growing very rapidly down there and is a very positive boost to that particular economy. So that one of the things I'm suggesting is if you're outside of these areas, you have to widen your scope and not just look for the little manufacturing plant or the high-tech plant or whatever, but look at anything that brings a net revenue into the area. And both of those areas seem to have found some.
Yeah, there is another hope, though, for the outlying areas. If we get the development in the science, advanced science research that I'm talking about here, focused in our universities at the Oregon Graduate Center, what we can create we have the potential for, particularly with the help we get from Senator Hatfield, chairman of the Appropriations Committee of the Senate, and Les O'Coin, who's very senior on the Appropriations Committee of the House, and they work very closely together. We could get an equivalent for Oregon of the research triangle that came to North Carolina. If we get that, what you get first are the research facilities of the various companies. They come in, they put their research facilities there, and then, as in North Carolina, what you would get then is the manufacturing coming along after the research, and they would go around to the communities that have labor force, surplus labor force, and put their manufacturing facilities in. That's how North Carolina diversified. Incidentally, in 1982, when we didn't get a single new outside plant located in Oregon, they got billions of dollars of new investment in North Carolina based on that kind of development. So we have the hope here that through advanced scientific research and focusing on our universities, if we do what we ought to do and take advantage of the opportunities we've got, we can do something to diversify the downstate areas of Oregon.
Ray, you didn't use the bell. I wish to thank Dan, Ray, Kevin, and Loren for today's program, 1986, Will Oregon Join the Recovery? It's nice to know that it was multiple choice responses. And I invite you to Pat Harrington address the Performing Arts Center in Portland, the future of that center. We are adjourned.